Good evening. Tonight, we begin a new journey through the shadowy streets of the 1980s, where the cases are never simple and the past is always just a phone call away. Our guide is Frank Mallory, a worn trench coat and coffee-stained notepad kind of detective, whose nights are filled with static radio chatter, cigarette smoke, and mystery. Each case is a whisper from another time. So, lie back. Let the city rain murmur, and follow Frank as he solves the crimes that others forgot. Let's begin. Echoes from the 80s. Frank Mallory, A Detective's Journal, Volume 1. Case 1. The Vinyl Clue. Detective Frank Mallory sat in his office above Baxter's Diner, watching the rain blur neon signs. It was October 1983, and the case in his hands smelled faintly of cigarettes and old vinyl. A local DJ had gone missing the night before his anniversary show. His last known contact was a late-night caller who requested Track 6, Side B. The record hadn't been released publicly. Only station employees had access. Frank knew the station, WZRD, had a shady past. Payola scandals, missing tapes. He flipped through the DJ's playlists, every song coded like a message. On the last list, circled in red, was Moonlight Motel Blues. Mallory lit a match, stared at the title, and muttered, "That place again." It was time to dust off his trench coat and head back out. WZRD's lobby still smelled like coffee and forgotten fame. A secretary in leopard print said the missing DJ, Tommy Lake, had left early. Mallory asked about the caller. She hesitated, then mentioned a woman named Rita. "She used to be his muse," she said. "Or his stalker. Depends who you ask." Frank checked Tommy's office. Empty, but neat, too neat. A coffee cup still warm. A tape left spinning. The station manager handed over Tommy's last recorded show. Frank played it in his car. Static. Jazz. Static. And a whisper. "I know what you did." He rewound, but the voice was gone. Only silence. The tape hissed like someone breathing too close. The Moonlight Motel sat off Route 12, where the neon flickered and time stood still. Frank remembered it from a case in '78, a runaway girl, never found. He signed the guest book and asked for room 6, Tommy's usual hideaway. Inside, the walls were thin and the carpet smelled of mold and memory. There was a record player by the bed and a single vinyl waiting. Moonlight Motel Blues. Frank dropped the needle. The music was smooth, low, haunted. At the end, a voice whispered, "Rita never forgets." Frank stood still. Someone had recorded over the outro. Under the player, he found a photo. Rita and Tommy, together. She was holding a microphone. He was looking away. Frank tracked Rita to a basement jazz club in the Warehouse district. She was singing, voice smoky, dress red as warning lights. After her set, she saw Frank and laughed like she'd been expecting him. "I told him not to dig into the archives," she said. "Some records play back." She claimed Tommy had uncovered tapes from a decade ago. Blackmail material. Voices of people with power. Bad men. He thought he could air them. Frank asked where Tommy was now. Rita looked at her glass and said, "Buried in his own silence." She handed Frank a cassette. "He mailed it to me. But I'm not brave." As she walked away, she added, "Don't let the music end here." Frank pocketed the tape and left into the night. Back in his office, Frank poured bourbon and slid the tape into his deck. It began with music, then Tommy's voice. "I found it. The 1973 recordings. Judge Mendez, Councilman Lurie, even Chief Radke." A pause. Then, "They'll kill me if this airs. But people need to know." The rest was static. Until the final seconds. A knock, a crash, a scream. Frank rewound, played it again. The knock was sharp. The crash, glass or skull, maybe both. He knew now it wasn't a disappearance. It was a cover-up, and someone had played the last note. Mallory met with a tech at the university's radio lab. The student filtered background noise from the tape, revealing background murmurs. One voice said, "Take him to the reservoir." Another replied, "He's not waking up." Frank circled the date on the tape. October 3rd. That's when the reservoir's gate was closed. He drove out before sunrise, fog wrapping the trees like gauze. Near the gatehouse, he found tire marks leading to a dead end, a glint of metal in the water. Divers pulled out an old Buick, Tommy's. In the back seat, a reel-to-reel, and a body with a broken wrist and a microphone in hand. The reel held more than Frank expected. Confessions, meetings, deals. He played one. The voice of the police chief, clear as day. "Kill the tapes. If it goes live, we're all done." Mallory made a copy, gave one to a friend in the press. The story broke a week later. The department's top brass resigned. 2 were arrested, but Rita disappeared before the article went live. Her jazz club closed. Her apartment, empty. Only a single note was left on Frank's desk. "Thanks for listening." Mallory kept Tommy's vinyl in his office. He never played it again. "The grooves," he said, already told the whole story. He took up late-night walks and coffee without sugar. Sometimes he heard music in the hum of streetlights. The case made his name, but not his fortune. He turned down offers for interviews, books, radio. He said the truth wasn't a headline. It was a memory. Tommy got buried twice. Once in water, once in silence. Frank only dug him out of one. The rest? He lets play on, just beneath the noise. Case 2. The Typewriter Thief. It was a Wednesday when Mrs. Callahan called Frank about her missing typewriter. The old woman sounded shaken, and Frank Mallory never ignored a call like that. She said her Remington Standard had vanished overnight. No sign of a break-in, no sign of a mess. "It's not the machine," she insisted. "It's what I was writing." Frank had known her late husband, a former district judge. Her memoirs were rumored to include names, dates, and more. He brought coffee and quiet questions, the way he always did. The study was too clean, but a note lay on the desk, typed in red ink. "Silence is safer." There was no broken glass, no jimmied locks. The back gate creaked as Frank nudged it open. A single print in the mud told him someone came quietly. Too small for a man, too heavy for a child. He found a snapped rose stem beside the shed. Inside the trash bin, an empty ribbon spool tossed in a hurry. A neighbor mentioned a tall girl in a varsity jacket 2 nights back. "Thought she was visiting," she said. Mrs. Callahan didn't know any teens. Frank made a note of the jacket. Red sleeves, white stripes. Louis's pawn on 3rd had seen better days and better morals. But Louis still owed Frank a favor from the Jenkins arson case. Sure enough, a Remington came in that morning. Sold by a young woman who wouldn't make eye contact. Said it was her uncle's and needed money for bus fare. Louis remembered her jacket, red with white trim. He kept the girl's fake ID and a scrap of paper she dropped. It was a note, typed and smeared. She wrote about Elise. Frank's pulse tightened. Elise wasn't just a name. It was the ghost of a case he'd never closed. Frank found her above a bike shop, flipping through old papers. She didn't run. She didn't even flinch. "I just wanted to read it," she said. "It's about my mom." Her name was Jenna Lang, Elise Lang's daughter. Elise had vanished in '59, presumed dead, case frozen. Mrs. Callahan had once worked with Elise in a courthouse filing room. Jenna had heard whispers, never truths. The typewriter was bait. The memoir was the prize. Frank saw the fear behind her eyes, and the need. He didn't cuff her. He asked her to tell him what she'd read. Jenna said the manuscript mentioned a romance, not with her father, but a man who worked in law enforcement. There were meetings, motel rooms, and then silence. One night, Elise vanished. Mrs. Callahan wrote about guilt, a warning she once gave. She wrote like she wanted to confess, Jenna said. Frank listened closely, piecing together names. One was familiar, a retired detective now living in Coral Hills. Frank had once worked his crime scenes, and now wondered what else he'd cleaned up. Frank drove to Coral Hills with a copy of the manuscript. The retired detective, Dean Weller, answered in a robe. His face changed when Frank mentioned Elise. He didn't deny it, just sighed and said, "It was never meant to go that far." Weller admitted Elise had threatened to speak. She disappeared after meeting him in a downtown motel. He never said what happened, only that he made sure the story ended. Frank recorded the conversation, then left. Weller wouldn't be arrested, not yet, but he wouldn't sleep soundly again. Justice, Mallory knew, sometimes knocked more than once. Frank gave the typewriter back to Mrs. Callahan quietly. She looked older than he remembered. He told her someone else had started writing too. "She deserves the truth," she whispered. Frank nodded and handed her a fresh ribbon. She promised to finish the memoir. No redactions. That night, a package arrived at Jenna's door. It was the manuscript, typed cleanly and carefully. On the last page, Mrs. Callahan's initials. And one line, "Truth waits longer than grief." Frank sat in his office with the rain on the windows. The noise of the city hummed below like an old lullaby. He stared at a copy of Elise's photo, now pinned above his desk. A name crossed out, a name restored. Mrs. Callahan's memoir would publish posthumously. And Jenna, now writing her own version, had promised to finish what was started. Frank opened a drawer, took out a ribbon of his own, slid it into his typewriter, typed one line, "Elise Lang, never forgotten." Then he turned off the lamp and let the silence hold. Case 3. The Disappearances on Cypress Lane. Frank Mallory arrived early at the office, coffee in one hand, the paper in the other. His assistant, Ava Rios, was already there, typing quietly at her desk. She greeted him with a nod, then said, "You seen this?" A small headline. "Third girl missing on Cypress Lane." The victims were all young, between 17 and 22, and vanished at night. No signs of forced entry, no bodies found, no witnesses. Mallory frowned, his brow tightening like a storm brewing. "Three's not coincidence," he muttered. "That's a pattern." Ava nodded. "And I hear there's a fourth who hasn't been reported yet." Frank tossed his coat over the chair. "We're not waiting on the cops." They found the girl's sister at a laundromat on Pine Street. She was folding towels too neatly, knuckles white with stress. Her name was Dana, and her sister, Lexi, hadn't come home in 2 nights. She walked the dog, just like always. Then, nothing. Lexi matched the pattern. Young, bright, night walker. Dana had filed a report, but it hadn't made the paper yet. She gave Frank a necklace from Lexi's drawer, a brass charm with strange markings. Ava took one look and said, "That's not just jewelry." Back at the office, she called a friend from the university. Something about the symbol made Mallory uneasy. Ava's contact said the charm resembled a sigil, old, European, ceremonial, connected to secret societies, protection rituals, or worse. Frank wasn't the superstitious type, but too many pieces were lining up. He visited the alley behind Cypress Lane where one girl was last seen. On the bricks, faint in chalk, a matching symbol. He stared at it, heart heavy. Who leaves a signature? A parked van nearby had tinted windows and no plates. Inside, surveillance gear, empty coffee cups, and maps. Frank didn't wait for backup. Whoever was watching, they weren't amateurs. That night, Ava followed a tip to a bookstore on Bleecker Street. The owner had seen Lexi with a man weeks before, tall, tan coat, gloves, bought books on ancient rites, surveillance, and hypnosis. Frank arrived to find the man had used a fake name, Paul Everin. Ava noticed something in the margins of one book. Initials L.D. "Lexi, Dana," she whispered. Frank's gut told him Lexi had started to suspect something. The owner said she looked scared last time she came. She had asked if any books could help someone stay hidden. Frank knew then she might still be alive. In the van, they found cassette tapes labeled with dates and initials. One marked L.D. played a soft voice, Lexi, describing routines, fears, dreams. She'd been followed, likely drugged, maybe lured. Frank slammed the player off. This isn't obsession, it's control. The tapes included other names. Some matched the other missing girls. The voice behind the questions was calm. Too calm. They traced the van to a P.O. box tied to an old real estate LLC. The address led to a brownstone with boarded windows. Inside, ropes, tape, tranquilizers. No people. But a mirror with the words scratched in glass. "You're already watching." Mallory sat with Dana and played her the tape. Her face drained when she confirmed it was Lexi. "She never told me she was scared. Never." Frank offered her protection and had her moved somewhere safe. Ava spent the night going through files. All girls had similar builds, routines. They all walked dogs at night. They all lived alone. All four had visited the same downtown vet in the past month. A flyer found in one girl's home was for a behavioral training service. The number on the flyer traced to another P.O. box. Mallory felt the walls of the case closing in. Fast. With a search warrant, they entered the brownstone legally this time. Ava noticed odd nails in the kitchen floor, uneven panels. Underneath, a false basement, soundproofed. Blankets, canned food, and a wall of Polaroids. Lexi's face stared back in a dozen frames, some recent. One photo had her holding today's paper, proof of life. A creak on the stair behind them froze Frank in place. A man in a tan coat stood at the top, smiling calmly. Frank stepped forward slowly. "You've been busy, Paul." The man just said, "She wanted to be understood." Paul Everin wasn't real. He had 5 aliases, no fingerprints. The girls had been drugged, manipulated, but all were alive. They were found across several properties, staged as disappearances. The man claimed it was research for a book. Frank called it what it was, a predatory game. The department hushed parts of the case, too many legal tangles. Frank and Ava got the girls home, quietly. Lexi left a card. "You believed me. That saved me." Frank lit a cigarette in the rain, letting the quiet settle. Not every story ends loudly. Some just stop breathing. Ava dug further into the properties tied to Everin. 3 were co-owned by shell companies tied to city contractors. One name kept surfacing: Captain Henry Drummond. Frank knew Drummond. He had vouched for Paul Everin's psychiatric clearance years ago. A report buried under other files had Drummond's signature approving the training program. Behavioral research, it claimed, funded quietly by the city. Mallory's hands trembled slightly as he reread it. Ava looked over his shoulder. "They funded it," she whispered. Frank closed the file. "We weren't hunting a lone predator. We were stepping on a program they never shut down." That night, someone broke into Mallory's office. They didn't steal anything. They left something instead. A folder, no return label, thick with photos, transcripts, maps. Dozens of girls, decades apart. Same behavioral profiles. One photo showed a much younger Frank Mallory, standing outside a facility he didn't remember visiting. A note taped to the folder's cover: "You've been part of this longer than you know." Frank stared at the ceiling as dawn came in gray. Whatever came next, he wasn't just a detective anymore. He was evidence. Case 4. The Stolen Shadow. Frank Mallory hadn't taken a real vacation in over a decade. Now he was barefoot, walking a warm shoreline in Santura Bay, a coastal town with cobbled alleys and laughter in the air. Frank wore a linen shirt, sleeves rolled, sunglasses hiding tired eyes. The waves whispered secrets. The gulls screamed them. He watched children chase kites near the shore. A vendor sold grilled fish wrapped in banana leaves. Frank took a bite, nodded in satisfaction. Retirement didn't sound so bad here, at least for the week. Walking back to the hotel through the city's edge, Frank stumbled into the old market. It wound like a labyrinth, shaded stalls beneath patchwork canopies. Bright spices dusted the air: paprika, turmeric, dried lime. Tables brimmed with carved figurines, silk scarves, jade knives. He passed live chickens in baskets, a monkey playing with sunglasses, a man sharpening swords. Whispers of legal and less legal trade buzzed in the breeze. A boy offered a vial of something glowing blue. Frank shook his head, but smiled. It reminded him of New York's underground. He was just about to exit when a glint caught his eye: a silver locket, the exact one from a closed case 3 years ago. The locket was on a velvet cloth beside antique rings. Before Frank could ask the vendor, someone tugged his sleeve. A woman, tall, striking, late 20s, in a coral dress with sun-worn sandals. "I need help," she said, her accent soft but urgent. Frank raised a brow. "I'm on vacation." "You're Frank Mallory. I know your work." She handed him a photograph, torn on one side, water-stained. It showed a man in military uniform beside an armored truck. "He was my brother," she said. "He disappeared here 2 years ago. And now, someone is sending me pieces of his uniform." Frank followed her through narrow alleyways to a guest house painted lime green. The owner barely looked up, handing over a room key with a grunt. In room 9, a wooden trunk sat at the foot of the bed. Inside, a neatly folded uniform shirt, a dog tag, and a weathered notebook. "His name was Matteo," she said. "We were supposed to leave together." Frank flipped through the notebook. It was half in code. "Military cipher," he muttered. "You sure he didn't have enemies?" He said he saw something at the base, something they buried. Frank closed the trunk and stared out the window. Something about this wasn't just a missing person case anymore. Frank visited the old base where Matteo had been stationed. It was closed now, rust climbing the fences like ivy. A groundskeeper offered coffee and a quiet nod. "You're not the first looking for him," the man whispered. He described another visitor, clean-cut, American, weeks ago. Frank showed him the photo. The man flinched. That's him. In the barracks, Frank found a hidden panel behind a locker. Inside, a cassette recorder, maps marked with red tape, and photos of cargo crates. One showed a crate labeled No Manifest, and a date, 2 days before Mateo vanished. Frank brought the tape back to the guest house. He played it in the small cassette player on the desk. Mateo's voice crackled. If this reaches anyone... I saw them move the body. He mentioned coordinates, a beach cove, and 2 names Frank didn't recognize. The woman in coral, her name was Camilla, watched silently. Frank paused the tape. Why didn't you tell me this sooner? I didn't think it was real, she said. Not until the locket. Frank nodded, then rewound the tape and listened again. The final line chilled him. If Mallory ever shows up, he'll know what to do. Mateo had known him, and predicted this. The beach cove wasn't on any tourist map. Frank and Camilla hiked through dry brush under the fading sun. They found a rusted chain-link gate half buried in sand. Beyond it, a tunnel carved into the cliff. Inside, crates, long emptied, and a rolled-up tarp covered in sand. Frank pulled it back slowly, half expecting the worst. Instead, a briefcase. Locked. Military issue. Camilla knelt beside it, shaking. That's his! Frank cracked it open with a multi-tool. Inside, documents, photographs, and a badge. CIA. Back in town, Frank sensed eyes on him. A man in a cream suit was parked outside the guest house. Camilla spotted him too. He's been following me for days. Frank approached him, cool and casual. Nice weather. The man smiled, too calm. You're far from home, detective. He warned Frank to stop digging. Let ghosts rest. Frank smiled back. Problem is, I don't believe in ghosts. That night, the guest house was ransacked, the trunk gone, but Frank had already mailed copies of the documents to Ava. Some cases couldn't be buried, not even under sand and shadow. Case 5. The Man with No Past. Frank returned to his apartment to find an unmarked envelope under the door. Inside, a black and white photo of 2 men outside a bar. One of them was Frank, younger, early 70s, but he didn't remember the picture. The other man wore a military jacket with no insignia. On the back of the photo, a name, Project Icarus. Frank lit a cigarette, staring out into the city's haze. He hadn't heard that name since before the East Harbor shooting. A long-forgotten case with too many holes. He picked up the phone. Ava, I need you to pull everything on Icarus. She didn't ask questions. She never did. Ava brought the file 3 days later, pale and silent. I had to break protocol just to find a trace, she said. It wasn't much. A blacked-out report and a coded memo dated 1974. The report listed test subjects, psychological trials, and field deployment. Frank's name appeared twice, once as observer, once as reactive subject. He stared at the paper, heart beating slower than usual. I don't remember any of this. Ava whispered. You weren't supposed to. There were photos in the file, too. Locations he remembered, faces he didn't. And every photo had one thing in common: a familiar man in the background. Frank had seen the man before, tall, always in neutral tones. He'd appeared in crowd photos from Cypress Lane, from Santura Bay, even Louis' Pawn. Frank checked his notes. The man was never identified. He pulled out old tapes, interviews, and case files. One reel from a 1979 case had ambient chatter. Frank enhanced the audio, a whisper behind static. You're almost ready. The voice chilled him. Not just the words, the tone. It sounded like himself. He grabbed a folder from the cabinet labeled 1977. Cleared. Let's see what I was cleared of, he muttered. Frank drove north to March Falls, a town barely on the map. The report hinted this was where the Icarus program ended. Ava called ahead, found the cabin still owned by the same LLC. The building stood on a slope, half-eaten by moss and time. Inside, he found a projector, old reel film, and a nameplate. Dr. Arlen Voss. Frank loaded the reel, dust dancing in sunlight. The film showed a group therapy circle, 12 men, 1 woman, and in the center, Frank Mallory, expression blank. The doctor asked, "What's your directive, Subject 7?" Frank on film replied, "To forget what matters." Frank returned to the city shaken but quieter than usual. That night, the man from the photos knocked on his door. No gun, no threats, just presence. "You're waking up," the man said. "That's good." Frank didn't respond. He was memorizing every detail. The man handed him another envelope. "This ends with choice." Inside, coordinates and a plane ticket under a different name. "Icarus wasn't a failure," the man added. "You were the control." Frank stared at the envelope long after the man left. And then he burned it. Frank met Ava at the pier just before dawn. She wore a leather jacket and a worry she didn't voice. He handed her a tape, his own voice recorded in the cabin. "Keep it. Don't play it until you need to." Ava asked, "Where are you going?" He smiled, half-shadowed by the pier lights. "To disappear. But this time on my own terms." The sea wind was cold. The first gulls cried over the docks. Frank turned and walked into the fog. She didn't call after him. She knew better. Weeks passed with no word. Then, one night, Ava played the tape. Frank's voice said, "If you're hearing this, I'm gone." But not lost. Not anymore. He spoke of hidden truths, the weight of silence, and letting go. "Case closed doesn't mean story over," he said. "Icarus was meant to teach us how to disappear from ourselves. I just chose to remember." The tape ended with silence. Then the sound of wind and waves. Ava sat there, listening long after it was done. Ava kept his office, dusted his desk, answered phones. She filed reports, drank strong coffee, and ignored the whispers. One day, a file arrived, marked Frank Mallory. She opened it with steady hands. Inside, a photo from the cabin, one she hadn't seen before. Frank, smiling, unposed, real. A note clipped inside. "Some truths don't belong to the department." She smiled for the first time in weeks, locked the file, and turned off the lamp. Ava traced the photo to a government archive building slated for demolition. She convinced the janitor to let her inside after dark. In the basement, behind a crumbling storage wall, she found a mural. Hand-painted, faded, but unmistakable. It showed the faces of all the Icarus subjects. Frank was in the center, under a sunburst painted in silver. Above him, the words, "Those who forget will protect." Ava took a photo, then noticed fresh cigarette ash on the floor. Someone else had been there recently. She grabbed the nearest file box and left quickly. Back at the office, she opened it to find a folder labeled Frank Mallory, terminated pending reinstatement. The file held psychological assessments, old audio from debriefings, and one report marked unreleased. Frank had once predicted the location of a bombing before it happened, in exact detail. He'd passed it off as a hunch. The files suggested otherwise. He wasn't observing subjects. He was reacting to them, like a tuning fork to trauma. The Icarus program didn't erase memory. It rechanneled instinct. Frank had been engineered, not enlisted. Ava sat with the file for hours, unsure what to believe. Then her phone rang. A hotel clerk from Santura Bay. "There's a man here. Said you'd recognize the name Frank." Her breath caught. "Is he okay?" The hotel was perched on a cliff, overlooking waves and ruin. Ava found Frank on the balcony, staring out to sea. He didn't speak at first, just handed her a folder. "Everything else you need to know is in there," he said. The folder contained maps, photos, a small leather-bound notebook. "Why now?" she asked. He took a deep breath. "Because soon, someone else will come looking. And I need you to make sure they don't rewrite what we know." She placed her hand over his. "You still protect people." Frank smiled. "That's what they trained me for, after all." Ava returned to the city. The fog, the street lamps, the same lonely office. But something in her had shifted. She saw shadows differently now. She filed the notebook under Truths Unclassified, hidden in her personal drawer. The next day, she started asking questions Frank once feared. The department didn't stop her. They knew better. And in quiet moments, when the coffee steamed and the phone didn't ring, she could still hear his voice in her head. A whisper beneath memory. "Not everything is a lie, but the best ones always are." She turned off the desk lamp and whispered back. "Case closed. For now." Some stories don't end. They rest, like files in a drawer, waiting for the right eyes to open them again. Truth, memory, and silence are all part of the same quiet dance. And Frank always knew the steps. If you're still awake, thank you for joining us. And if you're already drifting off, let the rain keep falling, let the neon glow fade, and let the mystery carry you softly to sleep. Until next time, good night.